Good afternoon. On behalf of the Jesuits of Canada, it is my pleasure to welcome you to our webinar, Rereading the Infancy Narratives, Israel, Palestine Today. Today's webinar is on the birth of Jesus of Nazareth in Bethlehem. This is our third and final session in this series, presented by Father David Neuhaus. Housekeeping. The presentation will be 90 minutes, and that will include the presentation and time for Q&A. Please enter your questions in the Q&A box. They may be missed if you enter them into the chat box. A link to the recording of all three presentations will be sent to all registered participants within 72 hours. And please change to the French channel if you would like to listen to the French translation. We begin with a land acknowledgement. Let us begin by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we are on today. In Canada, from coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this land home. It's my pleasure for the third week to introduce Father David Neuhaus. David Mark Neuhaus is a member of the Society of Jesus and a good friend of the Jesuits of Canada, and we're happy to welcome him back. Father Neuhaus teaches scripture in various institutions in Israel and Palestine. He completed an MA and PhD in political science at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And he completed a pontifical degree in theology and scripture in Paris and also in Rome. He is emeritus Latin Patriarchal Vicar for Hebrew-speaking Catholics in Israel and coordinator of the pastoral work among migrants and asylum seekers in Israel. Most important is that David lives with people of the Holy Land. He journeys with them, and he knows too well the suffering they experience in their daily lives. David, we have participants from all over with us today. Thank you for being with us. We look forward to your talk.
Thank you so much, Pat. I'm delighted to be with you once again for this third and final session, which once again we will follow with the aid of a PowerPoint, which I will now put on. Okay, I'm hoping that you hear and see as I hear and see. And let's read again the title of our series, Rereading the Infancy Narratives. That's in big script because we will spend most of our time with the biblical texts. And then in the end, we will also look at these texts from the perspective of what's happening in Israel, Palestine today. To accompany our series, we have here these two magnificent images. On the left side, an icon written by Robert Lenz, Mary, the Jewish woman. Notice the contextualization in the 20th century. Mary with a yellow star to signify her Jewish identity, the barbed wire of the death camps behind her, and in her womb, Jesus holding the scroll of the Torah, a Jewish Mary. And on the other side, a Palestinian Holy Family. And here we hold both these people as we go through the texts and prepare for the coming feast of Christmas, a somber Christmas indeed, another somber Christmas in Israel, Palestine. The painting is by Palestinian artist Maher Naji. And we will come back to this reflection on Israel-Palestine at the end of our session today. But I'd like to begin with voices from Bethlehem. Indeed, today we're going to focus on the child Jesus. After having started with Joseph, son of Jacob, the father of Jesus, in the first week, and then Mary, the prophet, the prophetess, in the second week, today we're going to focus on the child Jesus. And I'd like to begin with a Christmas hymn, The Drummer Boy, but sung a little differently from what you might be used to, because many of the verses are in Arabic. It will be sung in English, in Italian, and in Arabic on a rooftop overlooking the town of Bethlehem. And we can follow the words when we understand them. And if we don't, we can simply say a prayer for the people of Bethlehem, for all the people of Palestine at this time. Let us begin with the song, The Drummer Boy.
Come, they told me, param pam pam pam, a newborn king to see, param pam pam pam. Our finest gifts we bring, param pam pam pam, to lay before the king, param pam pam pam, ram pam pam pam. Ram pam pam pam, and so to honor him, ram pam pam pam, when we come, when we come, when we come.
في نجمي ضوت في السما من بعيد، هالنجمة كانت من ملاك الرب، ولد المسيح بارم بابا بام بام، سبحوه يا جميع الناس، هللويا هللويا. Sulla strada parapapam pam, un tamburino va parapapam pam, al ritmo del suo cuor parapapam pam, segnando il passo va parapapam pam, rapapam pam. Pam pam, bimbo dimmi un po' parapapam pam, dove vai tu? أولاك العيد في عنده وجهين، في وجه بيضحك والتاني حزين، والحزن الطالع من جوا موجوع، في دموع وصوت بيصرخ عنا جوع، مش مسموع صوته بمغارة صغيرة ولد طفل فقير، بشار العالم بفرح عظيم، خلص العالم من حزنه وأوجاعه، بتلاحم صار فيها حدث كبير وفرح كبير وأمل كبير. بشار العالم بفرح عظيم،
So with those celestial voices of young Christian Palestinians in Bethlehem, singing that he has come to proclaim good news, to take away the pain, to take away the sadness, to bring great hope and great joy, we focus tonight on Jesus, Messiah and Son of God. And this presentation will divide into two parts. One derived from the Gospel of Joseph in the Gospel of Matthew, indeed focused on Joseph in the Gospel of Matthew, and the second part will be focused on Mary in the Gospel of Luke, but both of our discussions will focus actually on the child Jesus. So let's begin. You'll remember in our first week we spoke much about Joseph, the son of Jacob, and he is given the command when the angel appears to him in his dream, you are to name him Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. We mentioned then that this is very significant because Joseph, in naming Jesus, is being proclaimed the father of Jesus. By naming Jesus, he is proclaiming his fatherhood. But let us now focus on the name that he is to give to this child, Jesus. And I think we all remember that Jesus, a Greek rendition of the Hebrew Yehoshua, is then explained as meaning he will save his people, and then added from their sins. He will save his people. But, and I'm sure you all know this, but let's repeat it anyway, I think it's very important to realize that for those who wrote the gospel, all of those using the name Jesus, Jesus in Greek, and all of those hearing the gospel proclaimed who had Greek as their language would make a connection that is not as obvious for those of us who speak English or other languages other than Greek. And that is because the name Jesus is Yehoshua in Hebrew, which we usually translate from the Hebrew Joshua. Yes, we must always remember that just as Joseph, son of Jacob, evokes Joseph, son of Jacob in the book of Genesis, and Mary the prophet evokes Mary the prophet in the book of Exodus, Jesus evokes Joshua, the one who comes to succeed Moses. Listen to the parallels. Who takes up his mission on the banks of the Jordan River, who will lead the people through the Jordan in a baptism as the waters split and the people pass on dry land through the Jordan. He will enter the land to purify the land and bring the people into the kingdom. Let's look at the verses that talk about the appointment of Jesus, the first Jesus, who in Hebrew we call Joshua. And I read here from the book of Numbers, Numbers chapter 27, where Moses once again reveals his greatness. Moses spoke to the Lord, saying, let the Lord, the God of the spirits of all flesh, appoint someone over the congregation who shall go out before them and come in before them, who shall lead them out and bring them in, so that the congregation of the Lord may not be like sheep without a shepherd. Now, why do I say that these words evoke the greatness of Moses? Because Moses knows that he's not going to enter the land. He has led the people for 40 years from Egypt to the banks of the Jordan River on the east side. And there he knows that he will die. Now, instead of complaining to God that he will die before entering the land, instead of begging God to let him live so that he might lead the people into the land, no, his concern is for the people. And notice the words, so that the people may not be like sheep without a shepherd. Those of you who know the gospel well will recognize there an echo also from the Gospel of Mark chapter 6, where when Jesus gets out of the boat, leading his disciples to a desert place so that they might be alone and pray and rest, they discover a huge crowd, and Jesus sees them as sheep without a shepherd, an exact citation from this text in the book of Numbers. And what's the reaction of God to the words of Moses? Let's read on. So the Lord said to Moses, take Jesus. Yes, if we were reading it in Greek in the Septuaginta, the Greek translation of the Hebrew text, we would see the name there of Jesus, Jesus. Take Joshua, take Jesus, son of Nun, a man in whom is the Spirit, and lay your hand upon him. And the first Jesus is then anointed with Spirit to lead the people across the Jordan in a baptism as they enter the kingdom. Very important parallel that is sometimes lost because we read our New Testament in Greek, yes, a translation into English from the Greek, and we read our Old Testament in Hebrew, yes, a translation of the Old Testament from the Hebrew, but the name is the same. Jesus, Jesus. Now, what is so fascinating in the Gospel of Matthew is that our Jesus has two names. Did you notice that? For indeed, the verse continues. Let's continue. You are to name him Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. All this took place to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet, and the prophet here is, of course, Isaiah. Look, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall name him Emmanuel, which means God is with us. Do you notice that here in the Gospel of Matthew, in fact, Matthew is giving Jesus another name, Emmanuel. And before we look a moment at that citation from the book of Isaiah, chapter 7, verse 14, let us notice that here Matthew is opening a parenthesis that will only be closed right at the end of the Gospel of Matthew. For here, in this opening parenthesis, look, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall name him Emmanuel, which means God is with us. Right at the end of the Gospel of Matthew, when Jesus is resurrected and encounters his disciples on the high mountain in Galilee, according to tradition, by the way, the same high mountain as the mountain of the Transfiguration, Jesus says to his disciples, remember, I am with you always to the end of the age. I am with you. An almost exact repetition of his name, Emmanuel. God is with us. I am with you. And again, of course, it would help to read the text in Greek in order to see that this is a play on that name of Jesus, that other name of Jesus, a name which we sing in Christmas carols, Emmanuel. God is with us. I do want to say a word, and again, full of respect for the teaching of the Church after the Second Vatican Council, I want to say a word about that verse from Isaiah. Look, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall name him Emmanuel. Many Christians say, oh, look, a prophecy. Isaiah knew that Mary and Jesus were coming. And I do want to say that that is ridiculous. Even if we find it very many times in all kinds of polemical and apologetic texts, it is not good theology to say that Isaiah was speaking about Mary and Jesus. Jewish people will always point out that the Hebrew text does not say virgin. It in fact says young woman. I don't want to explain how the young woman became a virgin. There are very good linguistic and biblical reasons for that. But I do want to say that every verse in the Old Testament has its original context. And Isaiah, who was saying these words in the name of God in the 8th century BC, could not possibly have been talking about Mary and Jesus. Let's remember the context. Isaiah has come with his son Sha'ar Yeshuv, which means the remnant shall return. He's come with his son Sha'ar Yeshuv to the king, to King Ahaz in Jerusalem, in the kingdom of Judah. And King Ahaz is absolutely trembling with fear, for he sees the armies gathering and they will invade, and he is stricken with panic. And Isaiah has come to tell him that God is with the people. Has he forgotten that? And he says to Ahaz, ask for a sign. And Ahaz, so full of fear, is unable. And so God gives Ahaz a sign and says, look, the young woman shall conceive and bear a son, and she shall name him Emmanuel. And of course, the question then is, who is that young woman? And we're talking about a young woman in the 8th century BC. And we're not sure who the young woman is. She could be the king's wife, who will bear a righteous son by the name of Hezekiah. It could be Isaiah's own wife, who is called a prophet in chapter 8 of the book of Isaiah. We saw that last week. And it could be just a woman passing in the street, a woman unknown. But this young woman has more faith than the king, and that's the context. So again, let us remember that although for Matthew, in looking for words to say Jesus, he comes across this verse in the book of Isaiah, and it speaks to him immediately of the Jesus he has encountered. And so he inserts this verse into his book. And for us as Christians, it will always be Mary and Jesus. That is not the original meaning. And we can respect the original meaning, always being aware that the verses of the Old Testament for us as Christians have a surplus of meaning in the light of Jesus, the Messiah and Son of God. So this focuses on Jesus is his name. Now let's move over to the Gospel of Luke and go back to Mary, the prophet. And here I want to focus on the one verse in the entire New Testament that is the Christmas verse. It is the verse that tells us about the event of Jesus's birth. And I want to read it and then analyze it slowly and carefully, for it gives us a lot more information about Jesus than we first think on reading it for a first time. So this is what it says. And she gave birth to her firstborn son, and wrapped him in bands of cloth, and laid him in a manger, because there was no place for them in the inn. Now, first look at the illustration, a very traditional Byzantine icon of the Nativity of Jesus. There is Mary. There is Jesus. There is what looks like a grotto, and we'll come to what that is as we discuss what is that inn. There was no place there, and rather she laid him in a manger. We will look closely both at Mary and at the child Jesus. Now let's go back to the verse. And she, Mary, the one that last week we defined as a prophet. And we are continuing now with her prophetic actions. She gave birth. She wrapped him, and she laid him. She gave birth to her firstborn son. Indeed, a firstborn son. Interesting. A firstborn? Well, if he's firstborn, he's not the only one, but we do believe that Mary is a virgin. She had no other children. But firstborn, of course, resonates with the people of Israel, the firstborn of God. The firstborn, called the firstborn son of God in Exodus, we saw that also last week. Mary gives birth. And then she wraps him in bands of cloth. Look at that little infant wrapped in bands of cloth. And she lays him in a manger. Well, are we surprised, or are we so used to the nativity scenes that we set up at Christmas that we are no longer surprised about laying him in a manger? You don't put a baby in a manger. That's not a place for a baby. And then comes the explanation, because there was no place for them in the, well, it says in. We're going to look at that word and see what actually it evokes, much more than the word in English. So let's go through it slowly but surely. We'll read it again. And she gave birth. Notice now I emphasize the prophetic actions of Mary. And she gave birth to her firstborn son, and wrapped him in bands of cloth, and laid him in a manger. And then the strangeness of where she laid him is explained by a negation. There was no place for them in the inn. The first thing I'd like to point out is that in reading this verse, of course, particularly if we read it in Greek, but also if we read it in English, and if we remember having meditated on the gospel many times, reading Luke 2:7, when we come to the end of the gospel, we have a sentence that is equally complex and that has the exact same rhythm as this one. Let's read it. Then he, not she, she is Mary. He here in Luke 23 is Joseph of Arimathea. Then he took it down. What is the it? It's the body that she gave birth to. He took it down, and he wrapped it in a linen cloth and laid it in a rock-hewn tomb where no one had ever been laid. Now, I'm not going to give a lecture on rhetoric and poetics. I think it's perfectly clear here that we have two sentences that have the exact same structure and that are meant to evoke one another. Look again. And she gave birth to her firstborn son. Then he took it down. See that body. And she wrapped him in bands of cloth, and he wrapped it in a linen cloth. Now, something is very striking as we look at the second verb. She wrapped him in bands of cloth. Look again at the icon, at the image. Notice that whereas perhaps we thought in a first reading that she put on the little baby a nappy, he makes pee-pee and kaki, and she wants to keep him clean so she can change his nappies from time to time. That's not what is being illustrated. And I certainly believe that's not what is meant. She is wrapping him in bands of cloth as a prophecy of his burial. Just as Joseph of Arimathea will wrap him in a linen cloth, Mary already, when Jesus is a baby, is, with full knowledge, the knowledge of a prophet, wrapping him in bands of cloth. For she knows that this child is destined for great things. And then laid him in a manger. We'll come back to the manger in a moment. Just as he laid it, the body, in a rock-hewn tomb. Why did she lay him in a manger? Because there was no place for them in that place that we'll come back to, translated in. And he laid that body in a rock-hewn tomb. Notice again the negation by which it's described, where no one had ever been laid. Look at the two icons. I've put the one on top of the other, the nativity and the putting of Jesus, wrapping of Jesus in his shroud, having been taken down from the cross and before he's laid in the tomb. Now, let's focus a little bit more on that word manger. And she gave birth to her firstborn son and wrapped him in bands of cloth and laid him in a manger because there was no place for them in the inn. Look at the icon and notice, of course, the presence. They are inevitably there in the icons of the Oriental tradition and in our nativity scenes, the ox and the ass. I think many of us think that that was an invention of St. Francis of Assisi in the medieval period. But no, Francis knew probably the Byzantine icons, or perhaps even the verse from Isaiah, which talks about a manger. Or right at the beginning of the book of Isaiah, in Isaiah chapter 1, verse 3, it is written, "The ox knows its owner, and the donkey its master's manger. But Israel does not know. My people do not understand." Again, the prophets are disappointed with the people of God. And before we point fingers, let us remember that the greatness of Israel is that Israel teaches us how to be critical of ourselves, how to go to confession. We could easily read it in our time, "The ox knows its owner and the donkey its master's manger," but we do not know. We, the people of God, do not understand. Yes, Israel teaches us to be self-critical. So notice here the ox and the ass, the ox and the donkey, and they know where all good things come from. They know who is their owner, their master, their king. But we do not know. We do not understand. Notice again the prophetic act of Mary laying him in a manger, for he will be rejected in his time and rejected still today. And so we recognize again Mary, the prophet. But let us move on now to that problem of the inn. What is behind that word inn? That is again very evocative of the identity of the child that is being born. So we move one step on. Again, we read the verse, "And she gave birth to her firstborn son and wrapped him in bands of cloth and laid him in a manger because there was no place for them in the," and now I'm not going to read the word in, but read a Greek word, which we're going to try and translate and recognize the complexity of this word as it is used in the Gospel of Luke. There was no place for them in the katalima or the kataluma. This is a very interesting word. In chapter 2, verse 7, it's translated with the word in. I'm not yet going to try and put another word on it, but I'm going to point out something very, very significant. In Luke chapter 22, again, we are moved to the end of the life of Jesus, just before the Last Supper. Jesus sends 2 disciples ahead of him into Jerusalem in order to find the place where he will celebrate that Last Supper, that Paschal dinner, the Passover. And he sends the 2 men into the city and says to them, "Find a man who is coming back from having drawn water, carrying a pitcher on his shoulder." Rather remarkable, because usually that would be a woman, but they are to look for a man carrying a water jug on his shoulder, and he will lead them to a house. And then Jesus says to the 2 disciples, "Say to the owner of the house, the teacher asks you, where is the katalima, where I may eat the Passover with my disciples?" striking the same word. There, in my translation of the Bible, the New Revised Standard Version, the word is translated gestrum. Notice there is something disappointing in the fact that this word is translated differently in Luke 2:7 and in Luke 22:11. The same Greek word translated by two different English words, in and gestrum. Let me point out further that in the many chapters that Luke wrote in the New Testament, 52 chapters, remember 24 in the Gospel and 28 in the Acts of the Apostles, he only uses this word, katalima, twice. Once in 2:7, Luke 2:7, when it is the birth of Jesus that is the subject. She laid him in a manger because there was no place for them in the katalima. And then in Luke 22:11, just before the Last Supper, Jesus is saying, or asking his disciples to say to the owner of the house, where is the katalima? Now notice what this does. This gives an enormous significance to this word katalima. In the beginning, there was no place for them. In the end, the katalima is ready for the mystical supper, the Last Supper. And what is the significance of that? Well, it goes back to laying him in a manger. Mary the prophetess. What do you put in a manger? What did the ox and the donkey, the ox and the ass receive in the manger? They received food in the manger. You don't put a baby in a manger. You put food in a manger. And Mary the prophet is laying Jesus in the manger because he is our food. Already she is pointing to that mystical supper where in the katalima, when there is room in the katalima, Jesus will take the bread, the paschal bread, the unleavened bread, and he will say, this is my body. This is my body. And we will eat his body, for he is food, food for a hungry world. Now we appreciate even more fully Mary the prophet, even more fully this magnificent connection made in the Gospel of Luke between a beginning where there is no room in the katalima and the end where the katalima becomes the place of the celebration of the paschal meal, during which, and that will be the high point, Jesus will take the unleavened bread and say, I am the bread of life. I am food for a hungry world. And I'll take it one step further. We're going to look at this word, katalima, in one of the places where it appears in the Old Testament, a text very much loved by Luke. And let's read it. From the second book of Samuel, chapter 7. The king is David. He now has a time of peace, rest from all his enemies, and he has built himself a nice big palace. Let's read the text. Now, when the king was settled in his house, and the Lord had given him rest from all his enemies around him, the king said to the prophet Nathan, see now, I am living in a house of cedar, but the ark of God stays in a tent. Let's stop a moment and try and understand what's going on. So God has given David rest from all his enemies. Like the kings of this world, David wants a nice big palace to signify his royal status. He has built himself a house. And then suddenly he looks out of the window, and with horror he notices that God does not live in a palace. God lives in a tent. Perhaps I'll add that a palace is a sign of the king's stability, the king's unmoving nature. Everyone comes to the king. The palace is in the center. But this King David looks out the window and says, "Oh Lord, the God I worship lives in a tent." And a tent is something that moves around. In fact, this tent, the tent of meeting, or in Greek, the tent of witness, moves around in the midst of the people. It has been until this time a very important part of the life of the people where God lives, in the midst of the people, moving around with the people. Now, David is not going to destroy his palace and go back to living in a tent to be in the image and likeness of his God, but rather his expression is one of contempt. He doesn't want a God who is not in his image and likeness. Now, that's a very chilling thing to say, for it is an indictment of David, who has become like all the kings of this world who want a God in their image and likeness. David wants to build a temple, a nice big palace for his God, so that his God resembles him more than a God who lives in a tent. And then notice what the prophet says to David. Nathan said to the king, "Go do all that you have in mind, for the Lord is with you." And that too is absolutely chilling. For Nathan, by these words, has become a false prophet. What is a prophet? A prophet is one who brings the word of God to the human person. And what is this prophet doing? This prophet is not consulting God, but saying, "Your words, O mighty King David, are the words of God. Do all that you have in mind, for the Lord is with you." But that same night, the word of the Lord came to Nathan. And then both will realize that the Lord is not with David, is not with David's intention. For that same night, the word of the Lord came to Nathan, and God said, "Go and tell my servant David, thus says the Lord, are you the one to build me a house to live in? I have not lived in a house since the day I brought up the people of Israel from Egypt to this day, but I have been moving about," and notice here, "in a katalima and a tabernacle." Again, what interests us is the Greek translation of the Hebrew word tent, because that is what Luke would have seen when he contemplated the scriptures, trying to find how to tell the Jesus story and finding the words, the syntax, the expressions in the scriptures of Israel. God says, "I have been moving about in a katalima and a tabernacle." A little word about "I have been moving about." That word is the same word that is used to describe God's walking about in the Garden of Eden. I have been walking about in the garden. Do you remember chapter 3 of Genesis, when Adam and Eve had eaten of the tree, and they heard God walking about in the garden, and they ran to hide? The same verb is being used here. I have been walking about among my people in a katalima. The katalima contains my presence. And again, the very important link with there was no place in the katalima for them when Jesus was born. But the place in the katalima is ready and waiting for Jesus when he is ready to celebrate that Last Supper. When Mary laid him in a manger, she laid him as one would put food in a manger. And Jesus will offer himself as food in that Last Supper when the place is ready in the Katalima. He is the presence of God, and we enter into that presence at the Eucharistic feast. Again, notice the glory of Mary the prophet. She gave birth to her firstborn son, wrapped him in bands of cloth, and laid him in a manger, because there was no place for them in the Katalima. I'm hoping that as we approach Christmas, this verse will become a lot more meaningful to those who are listening, and we will realize that each verse of our Bible contains depths of meaning that are revealed when we read them over and over again in prayer, in meditation, asking God to reveal to us what these words are telling us about the identity and the mission of Jesus, Messiah and Son of God, the one we worship. So we come to the end of our scriptural part, and we move now to a connection with our world. And here is this child pulling his little trolley with a receptacle for water back to a family that has lost their home in Gaza. The backdrop, the ruins, the rubble, Gaza reduced to ruins and rubble, the devastation of a merciless war. And in the midst of it, a child who will grow up in the midst of this rubble, in the midst of this destruction and devastation, if he survives. Of course, parallel to this child are the many, many, many children in Israel who are also living with the devastation of war. We want to pray for them this Christmas. Yes, we are celebrating the child that is born for us, who is coming into the world. In the words of the song, he is coming to proclaim joy, an end of mourning and sadness. But we are still in the midst of the mourning and the sadness. And so we want to pray for all of those children. Any one of them is a little Jesus come into a broken world. Can we look upon them and see that these children proclaim a better future? So, reading the infancy narratives in Israel, Palestine today, I raise 3 points. Can we dare still to believe? There is this image, a virtual image, of an Israeli and a Palestinian child looking on the world that we have created, not a world that God created. The world God created, through our acts of decreation, we are destroying. And they look on that scene of destruction. When we gaze at them and see the world through their eyes, can we still dare to believe in a future that does not contain the devastation and destruction that we are engaged in right now? And where can this hope come from? This hope in a God that is creator. This hope in a God who is always faithful. This hope in a God who brings into the world all the time babies that proclaim good news, babies that are an affirmation of life. That young woman who had more faith than Ahaz the king, more faith because she got pregnant. She bore the child. She gave birth to the child and named that child, and through him all children, Immanuel. God is with us. And until when will we not dare to believe? Until when will we plunge ourselves into despair? And I'd like to read, as a meditation at this point, from a document that a group of us in Jerusalem produced in October to commemorate the anniversary of the beginning of this latest round of violence on the 7th of October, 2024. We published in commemoration of the 7th of October, 2023. Dave will put the link to the entire document in the chat. And from that document I read, "It is also our faith that motivates us to speak the truth and oppose injustice. We are believers in a peace that Jesus has given us and that cannot be taken away. He is our peace. We must not be afraid to speak out against any form of violence, killing, and dehumanization. Our faith makes us spokespeople for a land without walls, without discrimination, spokespeople for a land of equality and freedom for all, for a future in which we live together." I'd like to end tonight's presentation part with a song, this time from Lebanon. Our images have focused a lot on Gaza, but tonight we opened with a hymn from Bethlehem in the West Bank, also undergoing a lot of violence, and we want to pray for the people of the West Bank. We also want to pray for the people of Lebanon, another region that has been facing extreme violence and destruction. And I'd like to read, we will hear the hymn in Arabic, but I'd like to read with you the words. It is called The Night of Christmas, in Arabic, Laylat al-Milad. The lyrics and music were written by a priest, a Maronite priest by the name of Mansour Labaqi, and the artist who will be singing the song, her name is Hiba Tawadji. But let's read the song. Afterwards you'll hear it in Arabic, but the song is very beautiful. The night of Christmas, hate vanishes. The night of Christmas, the land blossoms. The night of Christmas, war is buried. The night of Christmas, love is born. When we offer the thirsty a cup of water, we are in Christmas. When we clothe the naked with a garment of love, we are in Christmas. When we wipe away tears from eyes, we are in Christmas. When we cover every heart with hope, we are in Christmas. When I kiss my friend without deceit, I am in Christmas. When the spirit of vengeance dies within me, I am in Christmas. When estrangement is purged from my heart, I am in Christmas. When my soul melts in you, O God, I am in Christmas. We will now hear these beautiful words sung beautifully by Hiba Tawadji in Arabic.
تزهر الأرض ليلة عندما نسقي عطشان كأسنا نكون في الميلاد عندما نكسي عريان ثوب حب نكون في الميلاد عندما نكفكف الدموع في العيون نكون في الميلاد عندما نفرش القلوب بالرجاء نكون في الميلاد عندما أسجد أمام المزود أكون في الميلاد عندما تموت في روح الانتقام أكون في الميلاد عندما يرمد في قلبي الجفاء أكون في الميلاد عندما تذوب نفسي في كيان الله أكون في الميلاد
So with that song, we can pray for all the people of the Middle East, for the people of Lebanon, where that song comes from, for the people of Palestine, for the people of Israel, for the people of Syria and Yemen and Iraq and Iran and Jordan and all of the lands of the Middle East, the region from which Jesus came, where he was born, and where our eyes turn more and more as we move into Advent and celebrate Christmas.
Thank you, David. We've had a number of questions from people asking where they could send a donation or money to help the people of Gaza, if you could suggest.
So I certainly can, and Patricia, maybe you can be the coordinator of this. The Latin Patriarchate of Jerusalem, which is our diocese, through the very able administration of Mr. Samuel Youssef, is collecting money that is then used for relief in Gaza. So, Patricia, I will send you all the details, and then people can turn to you and get all those details from you.
Thank you.
And thank you for your generosity. We really depend on it. Your prayers, your generosity, your speaking out, and whenever you can, to actually come and visit us so that you can see our realities and learn what's going on. And of course, your visit strengthens us with its solidarity.
Questions. What is the significance of Bethlehem as the birthplace of Jesus in light of its historical and theological symbolism for Jews and early Christians?
So thank you very much for the question. I was hoping such a question would be asked, because I would have loved to have done a fourth presentation on the enormous tension between the two places that are associated with Jesus, and that is, we know Jesus is of Nazareth, but he is born in Bethlehem. And there is an enormous tension biblically and theologically between these two places, and they must be held together. So, first of all, Jesus is from Nazareth. What is Nazareth? Well, it can be summed up very briefly: nothing. Absolutely nothing. Nazareth is nothingness. And of course, I say that because Nazareth is never mentioned in the Old Testament. It has absolutely no resonance in the scriptures of Israel, which I think makes it synonymous with tohu vavohu. What is tohu vavohu? Well, it's that nothingness out of which God brought everything. And so out of that nothingness, God brings Jesus. But of course, in great tension with that is the fact that Jesus is born in Bethlehem. Bethlehem, of course, is a very significant place in the Old Testament. And of course, in that, Jesus can be recognized with the contours of a promised Messiah. Of course, in the Gospel of Matthew, what's underlined about Bethlehem is that it is a city from which a king will come, a Messiah will come, according to the book of Micah, chapter 5. But if we look through Bethlehem, and I'll run through it very, very quickly, we see Bethlehem as the city where Rachel died. And of course, Rachel is a mother of Israel, and she dies in childbirth, giving birth to Benjamin. And Bethlehem is that very significant place in the book of Judges, interesting, in Judges, where it plays a very, very dark role. For Bethlehem will be the origin of all sinfulness at the end of the book of Judges. The last 5 chapters of the book of Judges, 17 to 21, are punctuated with a refrain: in those days there was no king in Israel. And what does that mean? Well, yes, there is no crowned king. The first king, Avimelech, who was the son of Gideon, was an absolute disaster, and he's had his head smashed with a rock, and there are no other kings yet. But I think it means something much more significant. It means there is no God in Israel. For the people have turned to idolatry, civil war, sexual violence, military violence, and all of it originates in Bethlehem. And then we turn over the page and we enter that wonderful book of Ruth. And Bethlehem again plays a central role. Bethlehem, which in the book of Judges is described as a place of total darkness, will be the place to which Ruth brings her light. And Ruth is a new Abraham. Ruth leaves her people, her father's house, to go with her mother-in-law in order to become one of the people of God. And the darkness that Bethlehem is in, because of what happens at the end of the book of Judges, will be enlightened, illuminated with the light that Ruth brings to Bethlehem. And of course, Ruth is whom? At the end of the book of Ruth, we discover that this Moabite woman, this foreigner to the people of Israel, a people that in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 23, is destined for total alienation from God, eternal alienation from God, but will be the instrument of being a light to Israel through Ruth. She, at the end of the book of Ruth, will be the great-grandmother of King David. And of course, we know that Jesus, right in the first line of the gospel, the first line of the New Testament, will be called the Son of David in the Gospel of Matthew. So Bethlehem is very, very significant. And of course, plays a very important role in the infancy narrative when the Magi come and go to the king. Listen to this, it's explosive. The Magi come to the king, to King Herod, and they say, "Where's the king?" Can you imagine saying to the king, "Where's the king?" And the king then realizes that the real king, he's an imposter, the real king has been born. And so he assembles the sages of Israel to say, where is he to be born? And they say, in Bethlehem. So very significant, and that tension is very significant between the nothingness of Nazareth and the weighty prophetic implications of Bethlehem. So thank you for that question.
What lessons might Christians draw from the infancy narratives when considering issues like displacement and exile in contemporary Palestine?
So, of course, again, a very significant question for us as we live through the events that we're living through and we reflect on the Bible. And with prudence, with sensitivity and with wisdom, we need to read these biblical texts in order to discover not only where God was in those days, but where is God now among us. And I would begin with something we underlined very strongly tonight, and that is the title of Jesus, or the name of Jesus, Immanuel. God is with us. And of course, one of the things that the Bible teaches us, both in the Old Testament and the New, is that God is with us in a very special way when we go through the sufferings of this life, the displacement, the devastation, the destruction, and the death that surround us. We call out, my God, why have you forsaken me? And in that we recognize the very words of Jesus. And in invoking those words and that experience of abandonment, we hopefully can discover that Jesus is walking alongside of us, that Jesus is bearing the cross with us. So that's a spiritual aspect of suffering. But I think that there's also the aspect of opening up a horizon of hope that emboldens us to speak out. And again, we spoke a little about this last week, the Magnificat being a real song of revolution. Mary's prophetic song, God will overturn the powerful. He will fill the hungry. And to know in our faith that this is a reality that will dawn. We don't see how, we don't see when, but we know that God is there. And in God's time, God will bring these situations to an end. So again, this is a look of faith, But I think that that faith becomes action because it invigorates us, it emboldens us, it gives us energy to act. So it's not just we're simply waiting. In fact, the waiting of Advent is a very active waiting because it's a preparation. It's not, sitting passively and waiting in my armchair for Jesus to knock on the door, but it's the preparation, the knowledge that he's coming and the preparation so that the world will be ready to receive him. And I think that all of this is there in those scriptures if we take them seriously and we give the time that it needs to read them, contemplate them, and turn them into a motor that can activate us to get up and work for the repairing of a broken world.
In the Old Testament, Solomon is given the task of building the temple for God. Is the Greek word for tent, manger, guest room used to describe the temple?
Good question. No, it's not. And the building of the temple is a very, very complex thing. In fact, within the Bible, Old Testament and New, there are two strands that are intertwined. There is the strand that sees the building of the temple as a betrayal, as something not good. And that's the strand we focused on tonight when David had built himself his palace, wants to build a palace for God, and God comes and says, no thanks, I live in a tent. I move around. I'm among the people. And there is a whole strand of that in the Bible. By the way, one of the most eloquent enunciations of that strand, which is, I would call the anti-temple strand, is found in chapter 7 of Acts of the Apostles, the very long speech of Stephen before he's stoned. And you see there that until the time there was a tent, things were good. And then Solomon came and built the temple, and that was the downfall. So there's that strand, but there is another strand, and it's also a very important strand, and that is the temple is a microcosmos of how the world should be. So the temple is a place of blessing. It's a place where God dwells and where people can come and encounter God. But of course, the temple can become an idolatrous place if we go into the temple all holy and prepared. We've been cleansed and we are ready to worship God, and we give our whole being to the worship because we're in the holy place. And then we say, bye, God, see you next week. And we go out and we say, okay, we left God in the temple. Now the world is where we can do whatever we want. That's an idolatrous temple. But of course, what is meant by the temple in the positive stream of the temple is a microcosmos where when we go into the temple, we prepare for how to live when we're out of the temple. So the holiness that we experience in the temple, we bring out into the world so that eventually the world becomes the temple. And this, of course, is the end of the New Testament. In the book of the Apocalypse, the book of Revelation, which we're reading now in these very days in daily Mass as the first reading, we're at the end when heavenly Jerusalem comes down, meaning the world has been redeemed. What is the big difference between heavenly Jerusalem and earthly Jerusalem is there is no temple in heavenly Jerusalem because we all live constantly with God. We don't need that special place to go and be with God because we are always with God. So these two strands show there is a complexity in the theology of temple in the Old Testament and the New. But of course, what is overwhelmingly significant is in the New Testament, the whole concept of Jesus has become the temple, and we are called to be the temple, meaning both individually, our bodies are the temple in which the Spirit of God dwells, and communally, our communities are that place where God's Spirit dwells. So temple is very significant. Maybe we can do a series once on temple.
It is very difficult to ask Israel to make peace with the Palestinians when there are Middle East governments who want to annihilate Jewish Israel. There's no question.
Does that have a question mark at the end?
No, it doesn't.
Okay. I mean, quite obviously, what we are dealing with is a lot of hatred and mutual rejection. The Middle East governments, some of them, okay, and let's remember that it's some of them talk about annihilating Israel. The person who is writing that sentence seems to assume that all of them are. What is really remarkable about the Middle East is that so few of the Middle East governments are expressing any kind of anger about what's going on in Gaza. We have many, many Middle East governments who are remaining silent and ignoring the Palestinian question. But indeed, there are some who seem in their rhetoric to be committed to destroying Israel. Again, let us not ignore that we have an Israeli government who seems to be committed to destroying any chance of coexistence, any chance of finding a way that we can all live together. The aim is clear. We do not want to destroy, we want to build. We do not want to wound, we want to heal. We do not want to make war, we want to make peace. We don't want to create more injustice, we want to create or enable more justice. So this means that somehow we're going to have to find a way to all live together. And unfortunately, none of the governments of the Middle East are being very helpful in the search for this way forward. Not the governments who speak about annihilating Israel, and not the government of Israel that has at the moment a rhetoric of complete violence and war.
What are some common misconceptions about the infancy narratives that need correction in light of historical critical scholarship?
Whoa, difficult question. What are some of the common misconceptions? So I'd say that the very common misconception of the Bible in general and the infancy narratives in particular is that it's talking about a history as we understand history today. In other words, this is a simple journalistic retelling of events that happened. And of course, if we think in that way, the New Testament itself creates enormous problems because the two infancy narratives do not easily fit together. Again, that simple question, where was Jesus when he was 40 days old? So if we're in Matthew, he's in Egypt. They fled immediately to Egypt so that they'd be saved. But if we were in Luke, he's in the temple. He's been brought into the temple. So I think that there is enough there to make us realize that we can't read it in that way. And I would say that it's not very wise to attempt to read the Bible as a book of history or as a book of science in general. The Bible is talking about a level of truth and reality that touches relationships, relationship with God, relationships with each other. And in that lies the truth of the Bible. The misconceptions would come by trying to impose some kind of historicity or scientism on the Bible. And the Bible is not concerned with those issues, is not answering those questions. So I'd say that that would be a major misconception, which we need to somehow tackle and get over. And that is appreciating the Bible for what it's really trying to say.
The Magi's journey is often seen as the symbol of the inclusion of Gentiles. How might this narrative resonate with efforts toward interfaith dialogue in the region today?
So indeed, first let's start with the understanding that these men coming from the east are not coming from within Israel. There is some kind of interreligious dialogue, and more than interreligious dialogue, because let's look at the scene a little bit more carefully. These men are coming from the east, and what makes them most explicitly not part of Israel is that they don't have the scriptures. They're not reading the scriptures. They're not coming towards Bethlehem because they've read in the book of Micah that the child will be in Bethlehem. They are coming because they are reading nature. And that's the prerogative of the Gentiles. The Gentiles don't have the book that is written, but they have the book that God wrote, creation. Israel, of course, has both creation and the book that is written. But they are reading the star, and they are following the star. And when they come into the presence of the King of the Jews, or the one who thinks he's the King of the Jews, Herod, they are the one who brings the realization that Israel must wake up, that this Herod is not the real king, that God is the real king. And that again goes back to their very, very revolutionary question as they stand in front of the king. They say, where's the king? It's this declaration, we don't recognize your kingship. We are looking for the real king. And that creates a parallel with Ruth coming to Bethlehem. Ruth, again, is not an Israelite. She's outside of Israel. She's a Moabite woman. And again, I repeat, Deuteronomy 23, the Moabites and the Ammonites will be excluded forever from the people of God. And here comes Ruth, who is the example of what the people of God must become. Not only is she included, but she is the shining light, the radiant. So here it shows that Israel in the Old and in the New Testaments are open to that awakening. By the way, it's the same awakening that we have in the book of Jonah, when Jonah is the bad guy. And all of the Gentiles in the book of Jonah are exemplary. The sailors who immediately realize that God is working, or the people of Nineveh who immediately convert, from the king to the cattle in the street, they're all sitting in the ashes. Israel is aware that the nations have something to say to Israel. And if this is promoting interreligious dialogue, or at least dialogue among peoples, then it's right there in the scriptures. So I think that that's very important, that God's light, God's call can come from without when we are not conscious enough, we're not aware enough of God speaking to us. And so the Magi indeed represent those nations that have a message, and a very important message.
How does rereading the infancy narrative through the lens of modern Israel-Palestine conflict challenge or enrich traditional theological interpretations?
So I think that in general, when we look at the world around us and use that as the context in which we read ancient texts, it enriches our understanding of the ancient texts because it brings a dimension of reality to those texts. So again, when we look at the infancy narratives and we see them through the glitzy, commercial Christmas decorations, the beautiful but rather kitschy nativity scenes, that would be probably an understanding of the text that is rather removed from a first century reality. But if we plunge ourselves into the nitty-gritty of our world, and it's not the same as it was 2,000 years ago, but it's probably much closer in terms of being real than the glitzy, kitschy Christmas decorations, then we see how much it does bring us into contact with realities like violence, war, occupation, deportation, refugee experience, alienation, violence against women, violence against children, tyranny, dictatorship, etc., etc. So I think that reading the texts within the reality, of course, what is very, very moving is to realize that we are in the same geography. We're in the same place where these things happened. But I would not want to make that an ultimate value, because I think reading those texts in Yemen, in Sudan, in Myanmar, in the favelas of South America can bring that same realism to the texts that we miss if we read them in a kind of commercial, comfortable environment. Mary and Joseph didn't live in a rich, comfortable commercial environment. They lived in very, very difficult circumstances. So reading the texts in difficult circumstances makes them much closer than they would be if we read them through the eyes of, Christmas commercialism.
Could you please say more about how some religious ultra-right Christian groups believe that Israel must definitely prevail or triumph over Palestine so that prophecies may be fulfilled? Example, the rapture.
And I should say something about that in the 2 minutes remaining. So I think that once again, there is the tendency, and it goes back to earlier remarks, of reading the Bible as though the Bible is simply the morning newspaper. And that is always not only a terrible mistake, but very, very impoverishing. I think that the Bible is there for us to seek out the God who loves us and wants us to understand the good news that God is offering us in our world. When we talk about war as necessary or victory as necessary, I think we are talking a language that is totally foreign to the God who is inviting us into a journey of discovering who God is and who we are in God's holy word. So I think it's a perversion of the words. I think it's a perversion of the meaning. And I think it's the furthest possible thing from the message of the Bible that you can derive from the Bible. And that is not only when it comes to Israel must prevail, Israel must be victorious, we must supply Israel with all the arms that Israel needs in order to wipe out all Israel's enemies, but of course it has to do with lots of other ideologies that are derived from supposed literal words of the Bible, but that contradict totally the meaning of the Bible, and that touches on much broader frameworks of oppression of women, of children, of LGBT, and of everyone else who finds the Bible not good news, but catastrophic news, because it becomes a word of enslavement and of oppression. And so I think that really we must always be aware that when we read the Bible, it must be good news. If it's not good news, we need to go back and read again, for we haven't understood. Because God is our parent God who loves us and is not condemning us with words of violence, hatred, and destruction.
Thank you. We don't have time for any more questions, but David, I'd like to thank you for your insightful presentation on the birth of Jesus of Nazareth. Your reflections on the gospel accounts in Matthew and Luke provide a timely message. Situating the Bethlehem narratives within the broader context of Israel and Palestine highlights themes of hope amidst desolation and the enduring promise of peace in a troubled land. You have invited us to engage with the text as a reminder of the incarnation of Jesus into the world and the incarnation of Jesus into our lives. We're grateful for the entire series. The way you explore the biblical text challenges us to deeply study each passage to more fully understand the depths of the word. Knowing that you live in Jerusalem during these difficult times makes your insights all the more poignant, offering us both challenge and consolation. Thank you for sharing your wisdom and perspective. Some people have asked how they can visit you, and hopefully when peace comes, some of our participants will be able to study with you in Jerusalem at the Pastoral Institute, founded by Marina Fritz. That was a life-changing experience for me personally. Or the Center for Biblical Formation with the Sisters of Sion. And anyone who's interested can contact me for more information. And of course, we look forward to you joining us again in the new year. Thank you to David Mann and our translators, Michelle and Albert, for ensuring everything was working. And a reminder to stay tuned. We have some interesting webinars coming up early in the new year. And we have a journey to the 5 stands of Central Asia, Finding God on the Silk Road with Father Scott Lewis in April. You can contact me for more information. Thank you to our participants for joining us. Good afternoon.
Thank you.